These are among the most famous crowns in the world, and they tell the story of royalty and empire. Jewelry historian and author of the book Crown, Jewellery and Regalia of the World, Rene Brus, has been researching on the crowns for the last 40 years. Beginning from the Mughal era, he takes us through some of the most historic crowns from the Indian subcontinent.
The crown of the last Mughal Emperor, which was taken by the British in the middle of the 19th century, has by shape, it's often described as a skull cap. So it's fully gold, studded with tiny diamonds, studded with turquoise and pearls. And on top of it there is a kind of plume with some kind of feather or hair attached to it. But it was covered, that particular skull cap, by a piece of cloth, by textile. So probably when he was wearing it, it was not his most expensive crown. And there are some images of him also sitting on with precious stones decorated throne, which has a far more spectacular outlook than the one which is kept. What happened with that particular crown, nobody knows. And of course, when he was captured, a lot of the jewels were also taken by the soldiers as booty. In those days, the British wanted to get money out of their wars, so a lot of the jewels were auctioned off after the war ended, and soldiers who were able to buy certain pieces, they bought it. So there was an English soldier who bought this particular crown. He brought it over to England, and in the end he sold it for, if I'm not mistaken, £500 to Queen Victoria as something like a relic of the last Mughal Emperor. Another Ionic crown, which is fortunately still preserved in England, and in my opinion it looks more interesting as you are looking at through the eyes of a goldsmith, was given to the Prince of Wales when he visited India. And in Lucknow, the at that time nobles decided to give him this particular crown. Whether it was made for him, also no reference is preserved. So it could have been a crown that had been worn by the former kings or the former ruler of that state. This kingdom was quite influenced by the Western civilization. So there are paintings where you can see the king, because he was wearing using the title of king. A European mantle he was wearing, and his crown, studded with a lot of diamonds, as far as the descriptions are given, is really European in shape. What happened to that crown is also not known. When he was kicked off the throne, a lot of his jewels were auctioned off also in Calcutta, so they're completely gone, and there are no pictures or images preserved from the auction. So we can't say for sure whether that particular crown was taken by somebody and, who knows, still hidden in a safe, or that it was taken apart and the parts were sold off. So when the English became a master in India, gradually the rulers who were allowed to stay on their throne started to imitate the Western culture. And some of them also wanted to have a crown which was probably equally in shape like the English crown. And there were some colonial officers and government officials who were opposing that idea. So a lot of letters have been written from England to India and from India back to England to allow or disallow the rulers to have a crown shaped like the one which was worn in England. And particularly, they were probably afraid, the English, that the crown of the Maharajas and the Nawabs would become more elaborate than the one they were using themselves. And of course, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which is a very famous diamond all over the world, and probably everybody who is doing research on diamonds will come across first on the Koh-i-Noor diamond. That was set in a headgear in England, and it was particularly the women who has been wearing it in England. As far as the story goes, is that it would give bad luck to the men. So when some of the royals here in India would have a similar spectacular diamond, or even a bigger one, I don't think that the British would have liked that very much. In the 19th century, there was a moment that Queen Victoria was offered the title Empress of India, but she never went to India. And when in 1902 her son became King of England, he had the title King and Emperor as of England and India, but he also never went to India to be welcomed as Emperor. It was only his son in 1911 decided to go to India. Everybody thought it was appropriate for him to wear a crown during that ceremony. There is a rule in England that the crown and the scepter and what we call regalia are not allowed to leave England. So they had to make a new one. It's funny to read that the making of the crown, including the precious stones, had to be paid by the Ministry of Colonies. And if I'm not mistaken, it was something like £60,000 that crown costed. So in a way, India was paying for the crown of the King Emperor to be used during the Delhi Durbar. And that's a typical European crown with arches, and on top a globe and a cross. There were some discussions that when India was become independent as a colony, that it had to go back to India. But of course, the problem is, it was also Pakistan and later on Bangladesh. Which of the three is then allowed to say, I am the owner of the crown of India? So to avoid any problems, the British decided to keep it in the Tower of London, where it is still on display so that everybody can admire that particular crown. When I'm going to look through different dynasties, I think that Darbhanga is a wonderful place to see what kind of headgear was worn by the head of the dynasty. And that is something more spectacular sometimes than the European crowns, because there were quite big stones set into it. But also some symbols are used into his crown, for instance, which is a fish, because the coat of arms of the ruler of Darbhanga shows the fish symbol. When you go to Pakistan, where you have now Bahawalpur, they had more than one diamond crowns, or also studded with pearls. So he could choose different shapes for different ceremonies. The most famous one is sometimes difficult to describe, but Rewa had three interesting headgears, and they were particularly made during the second half of the 19th century. And basically they are gold embroidered textile on which all kinds of golden and diamond studded or emerald studded ornaments were attached. And there is one particular crown which has an ornament on top of the crown, which is normally worn in front of a turban. So it's the local ruler might have influenced, or the goldsmith might have influenced the ruler by showing this particular crown. If it is still existing, nobody knows, because during the independence period, also some of his jewels must have disappeared, whether it was sold by to some of the jewelers like Van Cleef and Arpels, reference are kept, or that it is still laying somewhere in a dark room. It's unknown. And the second ornament, which is for me very interesting, is the caputala, but whether I have to use the word diadem or tiara or sarpech is a bit difficult for me to say, because I don't know how locally this ornament is referred to. It was made in France, and the reference that one was made by Boucheron, and it would be interesting to know whether he himself went to Paris and sat down with the goldsmith or the jeweler and started to make a design, or that some of the designs were sent over to Caputale and that they started to make it there. There is another state, like Patiala. It is of course also quite well known as having spectacular headgear. Some sarpech were auctioned during the second half of the last century, and there you can really see that they used very huge stones, particularly the spinel, the red spinel, which is often described as a ruby, are spectacular, and it would be interesting to know how many more of those sarpeches were worn, because there is no description if it was a coronation sarpech or that it was worn for other ceremonies, whether it was a religious ceremony or a wedding. That's not known. Probably he had also more than one in his treasure room, like most of the rulers had. The third one for me, definitely Baroda, is very interesting, because they had quite old pieces which till independence were still worn. The Baroda headgear is basically a turban, and with a tassel on the side, and in front quite often a very big sarpech. There is one very famous diamond which came into the treasury, and that is the Star of the South diamond. It was sent over as an object from Paris, and during the reign of, if I'm not mistaken, Mohar Rao, the ruler, and it was set as a very big aigrette. That is a French designed ornament, but it was so big he could not wear it on his turban, so that's why they took it out of the ornament, and in the end they made a beautiful necklace out of it. There are many more of those headgears in Baroda which had been worn by his successors, and the Saturau III is shown on different pictures with different type of turban ornaments, which he preferred. I don't know. It would be very interesting to know whether he had also had headache, like some of the rulers described in their diaries when they were wearing such pieces. There was a moment in Baroda that they decided to take a lot of the diamonds out of the old pieces of jewelry and to produce a real new crown for him. Probably because he had been on the throne already for 25 years. It could be even then when he was having his 50th jubilee. And he asked Cartier to make designs of a new crown. Cartier did, and it took quite some years before in the end they decided to abandon this, what I call, crown project. Besides Baroda, there are many more dynasties who have been using, and some still nowadays using, all kinds of interesting jewelry and headgear. And one dynasty is Mysore. And there you have a very interesting shape of pagri, which is decorated with different type of ornaments for different ceremonies. Once a year, during the Dasara festivities, the ruler of the head of the dynasty of Mysore will be in his palace, sitting on his throne, and every day he will wear something different on his head. He will wear different jewelry. So you cannot say in India there is one particular shape and one particular headgear worn all over. It is in every state you will find different ornaments. Kashmir is also a state which had some spectacular ornaments, and there are some photographs of the last ruler wearing a diamond and an emerald ornament. Who made it is not known. What happened to it is also not known. Only that it was a spectacular object. No. His successor, Dr. Karan Singh, I don't think he wore ever such headgear, but he was able to find back a collection of jewels, which people said was lost. So whether this particular crown, which was amongst the lost objects, yeah, that is something I would be quite interested to know. For me, it's important to keep certain jewels intact, because then you honor the craftsmanship of the maker. And when you dismantle a particular piece, then it's gone. I always compare it with a painting of the Dutch famous painter Rembrandt. When it's too big for your apartment, will you cut it in 4 pieces because you can then only hang it on your wall? Nobody will do it. So I find it quite often a pity when an old piece of jewelry is not kept intact, but that the stones are taken out and the gold might be perhaps even melted down for the value of the money. When there are old pieces still preserved, we should not keep it in a safe. It would be wonderful if those objects could be admired by people. So the only place is normally a museum, and to put them on display. I have heard of the stories of the jewels of the Nizam of Hyderabad, which has been on display only a few times in the past, 20, 30 years ago. And it would be wonderful if it would be on permanent display, like at least in Europe and some other parts of the world. They honor the craftsmanship of the makers, and perhaps also the traditions of the state where they have been worn, and that people can admire it. And we have to ignore the value of certain objects. You simply have to look at the beauty of it.